Welcome back to Tomes and Tales. This video is part of our ongoing Odyssey study guide series. If you're new here, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series. This video covers the two members of Odysseus's household left holding everything together in his absence: his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus. Penelope, the queen of Ithaca, spends the entire poem managing a crisis most heroes never have to face. Not a monster or a storm, but 20 years of pressure to give up on a husband who might already be dead. More than 100 suitors have moved into her home, consuming her household's wealth and demanding she remarry. And she has no army and no formal political power to simply order them out. What she has instead is patience and strategy, and the poem shows this rather than just praising it. Her signature move is weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law, publicly promising to choose a husband once it's finished, while secretly unraveling her work every night to buy more time. It's a brilliant piece of non-violent resistance, and when the suitors eventually discover the trick through a servant's betrayal, it tells us how close she came to running out of options entirely. It's also worth noting how isolated her position really is. She has no living father in the household to protect her interests, an absent husband whose survival she can't confirm, and a son who, for most of the poem, is himself too young and uncertain to offer real protection. Every clever delay she manages essentially alone, inside a house that technically still belongs to her, but that she no longer fully controls. Penelope's defining trait is a controlled, watchful caution that never fully trusts what she's told, even good news. When word finally reaches her that a mysterious beggar in her hall might actually be Odysseus, she doesn't rush to embrace him the way a simpler story might have her do. She sets up the contest of the bow specifically as a test, and even after the suitors lie dead and the beggar reveals himself, she still doesn't fully believe it's really her husband. Her final test, casually mentioning that she'll have their marriage bed moved out of the bedroom, is the clearest window into her character. She risks provoking real anger from a man who has just violently reclaimed his home, purely to be certain, because a wrong guess after 20 years would cost her everything. Odysseus's genuine outrage at the suggestion, since he built that bed around a living tree and knows it cannot be moved, is exactly the proof she needed, and only then does she finally let herself believe. This caution isn't new to the poem's final stretch, either. Earlier, when the disguised beggar first appears in her hall and tells her a convincing story about having once met Odysseus, Penelope listens closely and weeps for her husband, yet still declines to act on a stranger's word alone, waiting instead for proof she can verify herself rather than a story she simply wants to be true. Penelope's central debate is whether she should be read as a passive figure defined mainly by waiting, or as one of the poem's most quietly powerful strategists. The passive waiting wife, reading points to how much of her story consists of grief, delay, and reaction to events driven by others. Men traveling, fighting, and making decisions while she stays fixed in one place. The counter-reading points out that everything she actually does in the poem, the weaving trick, the bow contest, the final test of the bed, is active manipulation of the people around her toward outcomes she controls, carried out with a patience and cunning that mirrors her husband's own famous cleverness far more than it contrasts with it. Many readers now see Penelope less as Odysseus's passive opposite and more as his direct equal. operating with the same tools of delay and disguise, but in a household with far less freedom to act openly. It's worth noting, too, how the poem itself seems to nudge readers toward this second reading. Odysseus, on hearing of the weaving trick from a servant, reacts not with frustration, but with clear admiration, recognizing in his wife's scheme the exact same instincts that have kept him alive across a decade of monsters and enemies. If the poem's own hero treats her cunning as a match for his, that's a strong signal for how we're meant to weigh the passive reading against it. Telemachus, Odysseus's son, begins the poem as a young man defined almost entirely by what he lacks: confidence, a clear role in his own household, and any real memory of the father he's meant to become. He's grown up watching suitors overrun his home and drain his family's wealth, and for years he's done essentially nothing about it, unsure whether he even has the standing to object. Part of the problem is generational. He was an infant when his father left for Troy, which means he has no real memory of Odysseus to draw authority from, only stories and a household full of men who treat him as easy to ignore precisely because he's never had a father present to model how a king behaves. The poem introduces him in this uncertain state on purpose, so that everything that follows can measure how far he travels. His defining early trait is hesitation bordering on paralysis, and it's shown clearly in how the suitors treat him. With open contempt, mocking him to his face without fear of consequence, because nothing in his behavior has given them any reason to expect pushback. The turning point comes when the goddess Athena, disguised as an old family friend, pushes him to finally act. Call a public assembly to confront the suitors, then travel abroad to Pylos and Sparta in search of real news about his father. That journey is the engine of his development. Facing seasoned kings like Nestor and Menelaus who fought at Troy, Telemachus has to learn to speak, ask, and carry himself like someone worth taking seriously, without his father there to do it for him. At Pylos, Nestor treats him with warm, almost fatherly encouragement, the kind of open respect he's never received at home. And at Sparta, Menelaus goes further still, comparing Telemachus's bearing and manner directly to his father's. The first time in the poem anyone suggests the son might actually resemble the man he spent his whole life failing to become. By the time he returns to Ithaca and reunites with the disguised Odysseus at Eumaeus's hut, Telemachus has visibly changed. He helps plan the ambush of the suitors, keeps his father's secret under real pressure, and stands beside him during the slaughter in the hall, fighting rather than watching. He even takes charge of small, but telling logistical details in that final confrontation, quietly removing weapons from the hall in advance so the suitors will be caught unarmed. A piece of planning that shows real strategic thinking rather than simple bravery under pressure. That shift from a boy who couldn't confront a room of squatters to a young man wielding a weapon at his father's side and managing the practical details of an ambush is the clearest arc of growth the poem offers outside Odysseus himself. Telemachus's central debate is whether his growth is genuinely his own achievement, or largely borrowed, propped up at every turn by Athena's direct intervention and his father's returning authority. One reading credits him with real, earned maturity. He chooses to act when Athena merely opens the door, and his handling of the Pylos and Sparta visits shows growing judgment that's clearly his own, since the goddess doesn't script his conversations with Nestor and Menelaus, only the decision to make the journey at all. The other reading points out how heavily scripted his journey is by divine stage management, and asks whether a young man who needs a goddess disguised as a family friend to push him into acting has really transformed, or simply been carried along by forces well outside his control, with his father's homecoming doing most of the actual work of restoring his household standing. Set side by side, Penelope and Telemachus offer two very different pictures of resilience under the same pressure. Hers built from decades of patient calculation carried out with almost no outside help. His from a much shorter, more visible sprint toward confidence with a goddess, and eventually, his father standing right beside him.